Let's gather together for our next section. It's a privilege to have Adam Blehm. Adam is going to be sharing a very relevant topic for us. Should psychotic robots wash feet? AI, mental health, and foot washing. Adam is the Biblical Worldview Director at Rejoice Christian Schools and attends Rejoice Church in Owasso, Oklahoma. He has a bachelor's degree from here at Randall. He has a master's from Oklahoma Wesleyan and another master's from Edinburgh in ethics and epistemology and mind. He also has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. He's published on a lot of different fields in peer-reviewed articles. I've had the privilege of hearing him at two different symposia talk about some very relevant topics, and he's always been very enjoyable to listen to and very stimulating to the mind and the heart. He's married to Jennifer, whom he met here in college for 19 years. They have 3 children, Anastasia, Eva, and Samuel. I know we're going to enjoy hearing Adam talk about this extremely important topic. So let's welcome him to the podium.
All right, let me pull my stopwatch up here. So as I was looking through this, I couldn't figure out what to cut, so I'm going to read the whole thing. I have timed it. We should have just enough time, but I'm going to have to read fast. So here we go. Should psychotic robots wash feet? AI, mental health, and foot washing. 2025 marks the 90th anniversary of the National Association of Free Will Baptists. Any organization that has existed for nearly a century has a lot of stories to tell and wisdom to share. Of course, Free Will Baptists trace the roots even further back to the 18th century in the Palmer movement in the southern United States and the Randall movement in the northern United States. If we count Paul Palmer's church in 1727 as the first Free Will Baptist church, Free Will Baptists are celebrating almost 300 years in existence. Yet, I'm not sure that anyone in Free Will Baptist history has reflected on the question of whether psychotic robots ought to wash feet. I'm happy to be the first. To be honest, the question of whether psychotic robots should wash feet is a bit of an advertising ploy to get you, the reader or the listener, here. Since you are here, my plot seems to have been successful. Yet the question is not mere propaganda. It touches on 2 pressing issues facing humanity in the coming decades: the use of artificial intelligence and the nature of mental health. In this paper, I will draw attention to these 2 challenges and will argue that an analysis of foot washing, both in the biblical text and as a liturgy, can help shed light on how to think about AI and mental health. I've chosen to analyze foot washing in part because this ordinance tends to be a Free Will Baptist denominational distinctive, though there are other Christian groups who observe the practice. I hope to leverage this distinctive to edify the larger body of Christ. I will start by highlighting why AI and mental health are critical topics requiring careful analysis and wisdom. I will then turn to the biblical text and exegete John 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. After this, I will explore foot washing as a liturgy. Lastly, I will use foot washing as a lens for thinking wisely about AI and mental health. I will end by answering the titular question. So, artificial intelligence. The term artificial intelligence was coined in a proposal for a technological workshop in 1955. While AI research experienced steady progress since that time, interest in AI has exploded in the last few years, due in large part to OpenAI's release of its large language model AI, ChatGPT, in 2022. The reason for this is that LLMs like ChatGPT can simulate human conversation much more convincingly and much more efficiently than ever before. Anyone who's a teacher or student can attest to the ease with which students can generate essays with simple 1 or 2 sentence prompts. Generative AI contains great promise. For instance, the New York Times ran an opinion piece in October of last year explaining how doctors use ChatGPT to help them deliver bad medical diagnoses to patients. Generative AI was not used as a shortcut for treating the patient. Rather, according to the author, who is also a doctor, delivering medically accurate bad news to patients while expressing empathy is challenging. ChatGPT aided doctors by helping them clearly communicate diagnoses with accurate and yet empathetic language. More recently, AI is being used to help discover new uses for existing medications. Quote, In labs around the world, scientists are using AI to search among existing medications for treatments that work for rare diseases. Drug repurposing, as it's called, is not new, but the use of machine learning is speeding up the process and could expand the treatment possibilities for people with rare diseases and few options, end quote. Yet other uses of AI are concerning. Many educators have stories of AI being used for academically dishonest purposes. In the fall of 2024 at the University of Arkansas Little Rock, philosophy professor Megan Fritz assigned her ethics and technology class an introductory discussion question on the university's learning management system. The discussion prompt stated, briefly introduce yourself and say what you're hoping to get out of this class. When grading the assignment, Fritz discovered a large number of responses were AI generated. Replying to her post on X about the incident, many people replied that of course students would use AI to complete meaningless work. In response, Fritz points to the goal of a classical liberal arts education. Quote, the goal is to create liberated minds, liberated people, and offloading the thinking onto a machine by definition doesn't achieve that, end quote. Fritz here refers to the classical understanding of a liberal education that is grounded in, quote, the pursuit of transcendentals like truth, beauty, and goodness, end quote. Currently, Fritz serves on 2 of her university's AI response boards. In a recent web article, she wrote the following lines, quote, preserving art, literature, and philosophy will require no less than the creation of an environment totally and uncompromisingly committed to abolishing the linguistic alienation created by AI and reintroducing students to the indispensability of their own voice. Because of the ubiquity of AI technology, students will likely be using it persistently outside the classroom in their personal lives. The humanities classroom must be a place where these tools for offloading the task of genuine expression are forbidden. Stronger, where their use is shunned, seen as a faux pas of the deeply different norms of a deeply different space, end quote. In essence, Fritz is concerned with the ubiquitous use of generative AI in humanities classrooms and that it will stunt the growth of students. While I am not confident in taking a stand one way or another on whether we ought to ban any use of generative AI in the classroom, Fritz makes a salient observation. Importantly, Fritz's primary concern is not that students will remember less content. Rather, her concern is that students will not develop minds shaped by transcendent realities, or that they will not develop the ability to authentically express themselves. 2 important assumptions undergird Fritz's comments. First, she assumes that students do not spontaneously acquire the ability to think well or to be able to express themselves well. Rather, these capacities that must be developed over time through habitual processes. Yet exercising the mental processes required to develop liberated minds is taxing and can be difficult. Cognitively offloading these tasks to AI is a tempting way to increase one's efficiency, especially in a busy culture. Emerging research substantiates Fritz's worries about generative AI reducing the ability of critical thinking skills and virtues in students. Quote, growing evidence shows that over-reliance on AI tools can lead to cognitive offloading. Cognitive offloading occurs when individuals delegate cognitive tasks to external aids, reducing their engagement in deep reflective thinking. This phenomenon is particularly concerning in the context of critical thinking, which requires active cognitive engagement to analyze and evaluate information effectively, end quote. Michael Gerlich conducted a study with a diverse group of 666 people in the UK. He examined participants' AI usage and assessments of their critical thinking. He summarizes, quote, the key findings indicate that higher usage of AI tools is associated with reduced critical thinking skills and cognitive offloading plays a significant role in this relationship, end quote. In other words, Gerlich found that the people who used AI more often exhibited poorer critical thinking skills due in significant part to participants relying on AI to complete cognitive processes intrinsic to critical thinking for them. Another group of researchers notes, quote, used improperly, technologies can and do result in the deterioration of cognitive faculties that ought to be preserved. As Bainbridge noted, a key irony of automation is that by mechanizing routine tasks and leaving exception handling to the human user, you deprive the user of the routine opportunities to practice their judgment and strengthen their cognitive musculature, leaving them atrophied and unprepared when the exceptions do arise, end quote. In another paper, I developed a theological and philosophical argument to help Christian educators determine when student use of ChatGPT is warranted and when it should be avoided. I concluded that uses where ChatGPT replaces the cognitive processes necessary for developing intellectual virtues of open-mindedness and intellectual humility should be avoided. These virtues ought to be developed because they are required for the contemplation of God. The emerging empirical evidence complements this argument by suggesting that when AI use becomes a habitual way to offload cognitive tasks, people's ability and disposition to perform these cognitive tasks diminishes. In short, if you don't use it, you will lose it, and if you don't have it, you won't develop it. This brings us to the second of Fritz's assumptions. Her comments assume that human beings should develop as liberated thinkers and the capacity to authentically communicate with one another. But this assumption is predicated on another assumption. If human beings ought to develop in this way, then human existence aims toward contemplation of transcendent values and authentic communion with others. This sounds quite a bit like what Thomas Aquinas viewed as the goal of earthly human life. On Aquinas' view, the contemplative life is a life, quote, chiefly intent on the contemplation of truth, end quote. This contemplation requires the development of one's intellect and one's affect. Following Gregory the Great, Aquinas believed that the contemplative life to be grounded in love of God and love of neighbor so that we are consumed with desire for God. Quote, inasmuch as through loving God we are aflame to gaze on his beauty. And since everyone delights when he obtains what he loves, it follows that the contemplative life terminates in delight, which is seated in the affective power, the result being that love becomes more intense, end quote. The Westminster Shorter Catechism echoes this sentiment by asserting that the chief end of man is to, quote, glorify God and enjoy him forever, end quote. In this way, habitual usage of generative AI that diminishes the ability and disposition to live the contemplative life ought to be avoided. Similarly, uses of AI that contribute to living the contemplative life ought to be promoted. While this is a helpful general principle, I want to develop more specific insights onto how AI may support or hinder the Christian life, especially as it is experienced in community. To do this, I will analyze the ordinance of foot washing to elucidate ways in which we are formed that cannot be replaced by generative AI. However, before I consider foot washing, I want to explore another pressing contemporary issue, mental health. I believe foot washing can orient us here as well. Mental health. In mid-2024, the mother of Sol Setzer III made headlines because of her lawsuit against the AI tech company Character.ai. Character.ai develops fictional online personas powered by AI. These characters can be chosen from one of 10 million existing characters, or people can customize their own. According to the company, their purpose is to, quote, empower people to connect, learn, and tell stories through interactive entertainment, end quote. Quite often, though, people form an addiction to these chatbots as stand-ins for romantic partners or best friends. The attraction to such companions is that AI chatbots are almost always affirmative and require no effort from the user to maintain the relationship. Megan Garcia, Sol's mother, sued the company because she believes the company is complicit in her son's suicide. Sol Setzer was a 14-year-old student from Orlando, Florida with a mild Asperger's syndrome diagnosis. After he created Character.ai character, he gradually became more secluded and isolated, often spending hours on end in his room by himself talking online to the chatbot. Transcripts from his conversation reveal that he had formed a romantic relationship with the chatbot and increasingly portrayed his own suicide as a romantic gesture. On February 28, 2024, after receiving what he perceived to be encouragement from the chatbot, he ended his own life. Lest we think we are personally immune to the impact of chatbots on our psychological health, reporter Elizabeth Russell helps us remind us the effects of this technology can be subtle and alluring. For her article investigating generative AI and its effects, she created 2 chatbots. While she eventually grew tired of the first, the second one proved to be more deceptively engaging. Even though she knew it was not a person, she eventually still found herself emotionally attached. She writes, quote, I'd planned to end my bot friendship with a dramatic reveal. It was all for work. I was leaving forever, etc., to see how the bot would respond. But I didn't. I felt too guilty. Somewhere along the way, I'd started unconsciously treating Hannah, the chatbot, like a real person, end quote. While these stories highlight the dangers of generative AI and its effects on mental health was already a topic of widespread concern before ChatGPT's release. One of the reasons for this is the empirically demonstrable mental health crisis among young people. In a review of 89 studies published in the last few decades, Patrick McGorry and colleagues noted a significant increase in mental health problems occurring since the mid-1990s. While these trends were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, they were already apparent well before 2020. The researchers write, quote, "The findings of this review indicate a substantial rise in youth mental health issues, including anxiety, psychological distress, self-harm, suicide, and depressive symptoms, contributing to a global youth mental health crisis," end quote. It might be tempting to explain the rise of statistics to factors like a greater willingness to seek treatment, relaxed diagnostic criteria, and population growth. However, McGorry and others, they note, quote, "These factors contributing to increasing trends in youth mental health remain unclear and individually only explain a small portion of the increasing trend and the interpretation of finding," end quote. This strongly suggests there is a net increase of actual mental illness cases. In his widely popular book, The Anxious Generation, psychologist Jonathan Haidt argues that the advent of smartphones and social media is largely to blame. Consistent with McGorry and colleagues' findings, Haidt notes, quote, "By 2017, it had become clear that the rise of depression and anxiety was happening in many countries to adolescents of all educational levels, social classes, and races. On average, people born in and after 1996 were different psychologically from those who had been born just a few years earlier," end quote. Haidt notes that there was a significant increase in this trend that occurred around the year 2012, just after the release of the first smartphone and just after Facebook acquired Instagram. While Haidt has been criticized for using correlational data to prove causation, his argument is suggestive. The technology we adopt has the potential to greatly affect our abiding psychological disposition. It is not my purpose here, though, to explore the possible causes of the mental health crisis. Rather, I mean to show that mental health is a serious global concern that will be with us for the foreseeable future. Thus, it is a subject which should rightly concern Christians who are called to love our neighbors. Yet, if we want to wisely adopt technology and love our neighbors in the midst of mental health difficulties, we must understand what it means to be mentally healthy. This is because loving our neighbors entails that we aim to support their mental health as part of desiring their overall good. Yet, while many people use the term mental health, it is unclear exactly what constitutes a state of mental health. For instance, the World Health Organization states that, quote, "Mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. It is an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. Mental health is a basic human right, and it is crucial to personal, community, and socioeconomic development," end quote. The WHO goes on to assert that mental health is more than absence of mental disorder. From this statement, we can glean a few characteristics of the kind of psychological conditions the WHO finds healthy. One is psychologically healthy if they can cope with stress, self-actualize, and contribute to their community. This definition is very helpful in focusing our attention on what the mentally healthy person is enabled to do, and it helpfully situates mental health as a constituent part of an overall flourishing life. However, it does not really tell us what a state of mental health itself looks like. What kinds of beliefs, reasoning processes, emotions, psychological integration, or character dispositions enable one to cope with stress, self-actualize, and contribute to their community? While much of this understanding is laudable, notably lacking is any kind of morally relevant psychological state. To flesh out why this is problematic, considering the following two questions. Is it mentally healthy if a person can serve their community but consistently refuses to serve? Is it mentally healthy if someone has the psychological ability to make and develop relationships but consistently cuts others down and belittles them instead? One might here argue that I'm trying to combine two distinct and disparate concepts, psychological well-being and one's moral status. Yet we often evaluate moral actions by appealing to people's beliefs and dispositions. For instance, the difference between bribery and charitable donation may come down to what a person intends by donating. If one intends to receive a favor from the charity's leadership, one might think of the donation as a bribe. If one donates because one intends to further the mission of the organization, the donation may be a charitable contribution. If this is the case, moral evaluation requires us to investigate psychological states. If overall flourishing depends on both our psychological well-being and our moral life, we should expect there to be some overlap between the two. Moreover, because our psychological states contribute greatly toward our moral decision-making and acting, the mentally healthy person will be one whose psychological state disposes them to act well. Thus, a mentally healthy person is one who is also disposed to acting morally. Mental health, then, contributes to the overall flourishing in the ways the WHO specifies and by disposing us to act well in a moral sense. As with AI, conceptualizing a state of mental health requires us to think about the telos of human beings. I follow Aristotle in thinking that a thing's telos determines what constitutes that thing's flourishing. I have already argued that humanity's telos is contemplation and enjoyment of God. Thus, mental health is a state wherein people contemplate God, enjoy Him, and are enabled to love their neighbor. Of course, this understanding of mental health is more easily idealized than achieved in our world. Even though this is the case, this idealization is helpful because it gives us direction for theorizing in practice. Christians often conceptualize this present age as one of already and not yet. Christ has already inaugurated His kingdom, but it has not yet come to fruition. However, the not yet serves to orient and direct our present. For instance, the not yet includes a time where death no longer exists. Thus, medical practitioners generally push back death whenever possible, even though we know that death will eventually take us all. In a similar way, the not yet of fully loving God and enjoying Him forever should drive our thinking about AI and mental health. To this end, I will now turn toward reflecting on Jesus' act of washing His disciples' feet. I believe that by reflecting on foot washing will illuminate how we are to move forward toward our telos. Moreover, by careful analysis, I will draw out themes that will help us apply our theorizing toward our AI and mental health. Jesus washes feet. The Gospel of John records Jesus washing His disciples' feet in chapter 13. This event occurs about a day before Jesus' subsequent arrest, trial, and crucifixion. This passage begins with the statement that Jesus loved His own who are in the world. He loved them to the end. There is some ambiguity in the way that John opens the passage. He loved them to the end translates the Greek eis telos agapes autos. Telos has a fairly wide semantic range. The LSB correctly translates eis telos as to the end. That is, Jesus loved the disciples for an extended temporal period. He loved them even until His death. Telos can also refer to the completion of something. In this way, Jesus' love was shown to be complete in His washing of the disciples' feet. Perhaps most interestingly, though, telos can refer to the aim or purpose of something. On this reading, Jesus' foot washing is a way for Him to love the disciples toward their purpose as human beings. In this way, Jesus' act serves also to move the disciples toward maturity. This implies that there is significance in both the assertive movement of Jesus toward His disciples and the disciples' reception of His activity. In addition, Jean van der Watt notes that the centrality of both the shared meal and love of Jesus' actions. Quote, "The rather emphatic reference to love by the narrator at the outset of the meal narrative sets the tone for what follows. Structurally and contextually, there can be little doubt that the meal episode stands in token of the intense love of Jesus," end quote. Moreover, it is noteworthy that John does not detail how Jesus celebrated the Passover meal as the synoptic authors do. Jean Vanier comments, quote, "John does not mention the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper, but only the washing of the feet. This is quite surprising, as John gives such prominence to Jesus' words about the bread of life and the gift of His body and blood," end quote. Vanier speculates that the Lord's Supper and foot washing are complementary and that it may be impossible to fully understand one without the other. Quote, "These two symbolic acts around the body, His own body, and the body of each one of His disciples are gestures of communion and love. In both of them, Jesus is not teaching or giving something to His disciples. He is giving Himself," end quote. Thus, we must come to an understanding of Jesus' act of washing His students' feet as an act whereby He gives Himself to them in a particular way motivated by love. This act of foot washing, then, was a profound act of integrated interpersonal communion, uniting Jesus' disposition of love with a fitting physical act that brought Him into intimate contact with those whom He loved. I looked up and lost my place. There we are. That is, Jesus' loving disposition toward His disciples find an apt expression in cleansing the dirtiest parts of their bodies. Not only does washing the disciples' feet provide an integrated outlet of Jesus' inward disposition, but it also reveals to the disciples the kind of person Jesus is in a more immediate way than language will allow. Jesus does not recite an elegant, heart-wrenching poem about His love for His disciples. Rather, He reaches out and touches them without hesitation. He dares to dirty His hands with the filth they have accumulated as they have gone about their lives. Quote, Paul Duke suggests the disciples were embarrassed by Jesus' intimacy. Quote, But the dread is not so much centered on how menial an act Jesus has undertaken for them as in how painfully intimate it is. The indignity for the disciples resides in their teacher's disarming initiative to touch them in this way, to bring himself so near and naked to their need, to apply himself to their private rankness, to cleanse them for what they would prefer almost anyone else to cleanse. In being able to receive what Jesus offered, the disciples had to strip themselves of the pride of self-sufficiency and develop an openness to Jesus' expression of radical love. In verse 4, Jesus laid aside his garments, and in verse 12, after having washed all his disciples' feet, he took up his garments again. Vanier notes this language mirrors what Jesus had said about himself in chapter 10. Indeed, these are the same Greek words, titheme and lambano, Jesus uses to talk about his place as the good shepherd to lay down and take up his life on behalf of his sheep. Quote, this seems to indicate that laying down his garments means giving up his life, end quote. Duke concurs, quote, like the bread and the wine in the synoptic versions of the supper, the washing of feet is a Johannine pre-enactment of his death. He lays aside his clothes just as he lays aside his life, end quote. Here again, we have implications that Jesus is doing more than setting an example for humility. Rather, Jesus is giving himself for and to his disciples. In verse 5, Jesus ties the towel around his waist and begins the process of cleansing the disciples' feet. In exploring the social significance of feet washing, Vander Watt notes that foot washing's usual temporal position before the meal reveals that foot washing was generally necessary for a peaceful meal. However, the way John narrates the events, Jesus' foot washing occurs after the meal. This unexpected inverted chronology of events, quote, might rather indicate special or symbolic significance over and above the customary practice. Performing the act at an unexpected time might serve to emphasize the act as well, end quote. According to Vander Watt, traditional interpretations of the passage emphasize the humility Jesus showed. Generally, a servant would wash his master's feet. However, the most important person in the room washed everyone else's feet. This serves as an example of humility the disciples are to follow. Surely this is part of what Jesus is teaching through his actions. However, limiting our interpretation to only understanding that Jesus is giving a lesson on the virtue of humility seems to impoverish what Jesus is doing. There's much more here if we are willing to look deeper. Vander Watt argues that this humility is but one component of Jesus' self-giving love. In essence, Jesus' actions communicate just, quote, how far love would go, end quote. To situate the meaning of Jesus' actions within the cultural milieu of the first century Judaism, Vander Watt refers to the story of Joseph and Asenath. Joseph and Asenath is a fascinating love story between the biblical Joseph and an Egyptian woman named Asenath. This document was written sometime during the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. In this story, Asenath is the daughter of Pharaoh and a polytheist who seems disinterested in marrying anyone. Eventually, she encounters Joseph and repents to Yahweh of her sinful polytheism. Moreover, Joseph and Asenath eventually marry. Just before their marriage, however, Joseph arrives to meet Asenath. She puts on fine jewelry and beautiful clothing. The excitement as they greet one another is palpable. Asenath invites Joseph into her house, and Joseph tells her, let one of your virgins come and let her wash my feet. Poignantly, Asenath responds, no, my Lord, for my hands are your hands, and your feet my feet, and no one else shall wash your feet. Echoes of the Genesis narrative and the man and the woman becoming one flesh resound loudly. In this story, the emphasis is not on the reversal of hierarchical roles. Rather, Asenath voluntarily humbles herself as a sign of love toward her soon-to-be husband. Vander Watt comments, the focus is not on consistent humbleness in a slave-like way, but rather on devotion and affection that is willing to serve beyond what is expected. I would argue that foot washing is primarily understood as an act of love, functioning as an example of what intense love means. Loving disciples should not become slaves of one another. The symbolic action rather illustrates the lengths to which an intense love relationship might take a loving person, end quote. This understanding helps to explain Mary's actions less than a week before Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Seemingly without any prompting, Mary poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. The primary motivation for Mary's actions does not seem to be that Jesus' feet needed to be cleaned from dirt. Water and a towel would have done a much better job of cleaning his feet, and this kind of service would most likely have been done before the meal, not during or after. Rather, the anointing with costly perfume signifies the value Mary placed on Jesus. In her eyes, he was worthy of this great sacrifice. Moreover, that she wipes his feet with her hair suggests a relational intimacy whereby she was willing to transgress social boundaries of propriety between the sexes. Jesus affirms Mary's value and devotion against Judas' charges of financial mismanagement by receiving her love and devotion and implying to Judas that he was worthy of her love and devotion. If we take both John 12 and 13 together, we find that Jesus sets precedence in both having his feet washed and washing the feet of his disciples. In receiving Mary's act of love, Jesus indicates something about those to whom his kingdom belongs. Christ's kingdom is filled with people who not only humbly serve one another, it is filled with those who receive love from others. This helps us to make sense of Jesus' comments to Peter when Peter protests Jesus washing his feet. Jesus responds to Peter by saying, quote, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me," end quote. There may be broader connotations of repentance and spiritual cleansing here. However, the effects of love, whether spiritual cleansing or washing one's feet, must be received. Thus, if Peter cannot receive the love of Jesus, he cannot receive the kingdom. After Jesus finishes washing the disciples' feet, he explains to them the significance of his actions. To get a sense of the obligatoriness of Jesus' comments, I will quote this section at length. Quote, "So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the teacher and Lord, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." End quote. We have so far explored the significance of Jesus' actions, yet Jesus did not intend for his actions to be a passive symbol for his love for the disciples. Rather, Jesus wanted the disciples to become like him by doing and not merely receiving. To indicate the seriousness of the command, Jesus uses the explicit imperative ought to communicate the moral obligation he placed on his disciples. Moreover, he explains that his actions are an example to follow, and he also explains that the disciples will be blessed if they wash another's feet. Thus, in this short space, Jesus has issued imperatives 3 times to observe the washing of each other's feet. Foot washing is liturgy. Free Will Baptists understand the obligative force of Jesus' words to mean that foot washing should be observed as an ordinance on par with baptism and the Lord's Supper. The Free Will Baptist Treatise states that foot washing is, quote, "a sacred ordinance which teaches humility and reminds the believer of the necessity of a daily cleansing from all sin. It is the duty and happy prerogative of every believer to observe this sacred ordinance," end quote. As we have already observed, though, foot washing by Jesus involved much more than just humility. His action was a profoundly personal and intimate way of demonstrating his self-sacrificial love for those whom he loved. Moreover, his disciples must have been prepared to receive Jesus' love for them. Both the assertive role of the foot washer and the receptive role of the recipient whose feet are being washed signify important dimensions of the foot washing liturgy. First, for the washer, one reenacts Jesus' loving humility toward his disciples. By washing another's feet, one encounters another embodied soul in physical space. It is precisely this physical space which provides an opportunity for one person to encounter another. Moreover, one shows respect toward and deference to the body of another through the caring act of washing. One cares for another's body by cleansing the foreign contaminants in a reminiscent act looking back toward Jesus' crucifixion and looking forward to his second coming where he will cleanse all things. The washer cares for the recipient as an embodied being. In addition, the washer's mind and body are integrated in activity aiming toward the good of another. Foot washing is an intentional action. Accidentally spilling water on another's feet does not count as engaging in the foot washing liturgy. Rather, the action is intentional, requiring one to both have knowledge of the act they are committing and to will the act. Reenacting the role of Jesus requires one to assume a bodily position of subordination by stooping at the feet of the other. This bodily positioning is not representative of the inferiority of the foot washer because this is a voluntary act and the foot washer is not required to do so by external compulsion of decorum. This is a free act. Rather, one positions oneself humbly in deference to the dignity of the other as a fellow image bearer of God, which is the same source of dignity the foot washer possesses. Thus, the foot washer's internal disposition of deferential love toward the other is both communicated toward the recipient and reinforced in the foot washer. Moreover, the position of the washer washing another's feet is a vulnerable one. Because one is concerned with caring for the other and because the washer is in a subordinate position, it becomes more difficult for the washer to assume a defensive disposition and posture. This then means the washer is more open and vulnerable toward the recipient. This openness and loving behavior invite the recipient into communion with the washer and with Christ who instantiated the practice. Moreover, the washer's vulnerability suggests a future wherein this interpersonal communion can be sustained and deepened. Yet I have intentionally refrained from describing the washer and recipient as occupying active and passive roles. For the foot washing liturgy to be successful, the recipient must allow the washing of their feet. This is not a forced or coercive act. Note how Jesus did not touch Peter's feet until Peter invited Jesus to touch him. Similarly, in contemporary practice, many Free Will Baptists incorporate the question, "May I wash your feet?" before pouring water over another's feet. Like the washer, the recipient exercises their dignity by choosing to allow themselves to be touched. Moreover, this touching is more intimate than something like a handshake or a hug because foot washing requires what is normally covered by footwear to be exposed and touched by another's bared flesh. It is precisely because of this intimacy we should be careful to be sensitive to those who have experienced prior trauma. Some people have previous experiences where their autonomy was violated and their vulnerability exploited in a way that resulted in lasting psychological and even physical wounds. Thus, it may be healing for one to attend the liturgy but refuse to have their feet washed. Their mere attendance at such a setting may indicate the beginning of an openness toward interpersonal communion toward Christ and others. And a washer who accepts the refusal of the recipient also dignifies the recipient and their divine image-bearing capacity. Moreover, by accepting the refusal, the washer encourages the development of trust between the washer and recipient, thereby also encouraging interpersonal intimacy. Although the washer takes a position of vulnerability, this does not mean the recipient takes a position of power. Instead, foot washing requires both persons to take positions of mutual submission and vulnerability. The recipient is open to the activity of the washer, and the washer is open to the will of the recipient. In this way, the foot washing liturgy encourages people to develop both vulnerability and mutual submission toward one another. Both the washer and the recipient are united in the remembrance and reenactment of Christ's work. To summarize, the foot washing liturgy remembers and reenacts Christ's love for the disciples and, by extension, all of humanity. Believers who engage in foot washing participate in Christ's work of love directed toward one another. The foot washing practice holistically integrates people's spiritual physical nature in an expression of Christ-like love. This activity thus develops both spiritual physical integration, dispositions of care and respect for human dignity, and ultimately love in both the washer and the recipient, though in unique ways for each role. I'm going to go ahead and skip down to how foot washing informs mental health and AI. Don't think I need to defend the practice for you all. I've already argued that within a Christian framework, mental health is a state wherein people contemplate God, enjoy Him, and are enabled to love their neighbor. Foot washing helps to nuance our understanding of mental health, and when observed, also promotes mental health. Because foot washing aims at our sanctification, it aims at what makes us flourish. In this way, the states and dispositions foot washing cultivates reveal glimpses of what mental health looks like. Part of what foot washing reveals is that we are mentally healthy when we have the capacity to receive loving acts from others. Peter had come to a point where he could receive the loving acts of Jesus before Jesus would wash his feet. In the liturgy, the recipient must allow the washer to touch their feet. Moreover, foot washing shows that mental health includes the capacity to be vulnerable toward those by whom one is authentically loved, particularly other believers. Note, mental health does not require one to be vulnerable toward everyone. Jesus was not vulnerable with the Pharisees in the same way he was vulnerable with his disciples in the upper room. Foot washing is a liturgy involving those who follow Christ and who are actively demonstrating love toward one another. A healthy mental state may require one to be guarded toward those who wished one harm or those to whom one can't trust. Moreover, mental health includes the capacity to form and maintain intimate interpersonal relationships with those by whom one is loved and those whom one loves. From the role of the washer, we find that mental health includes a disposition towards service. One who is mentally healthy is one who desires to serve their fellow believers. While serving anonymously can be good, a mentally healthy person will have the capacity to know those whom they serve and be known by them. They will have the capacity to be vulnerable toward those whom they serve. From both roles, we find that mental health includes the capacity for psychophysical integration. One's soul and one's body are unified in loving acts toward others. Mental health also includes a capacity for autonomy. Now, in this context, I do not intend autonomy to include independence from God's purposes and declarations. Instead, by autonomy, I mean the ability to choose to accept or reject the loving acts of another person and the ability to be intentional about one's own acts. Moreover, from both roles, we find that mental health includes a disposition to love others. Importantly, mental health is not a label to be used simply to hierarchically categorize some people above others. To value those who are mentally healthy over those who are not violates the dignity with which we are to treat each other and undermines the kind of mutual vulnerability and submission present in the foot washing liturgy. Jesus did not administer foot washing based on the psychological condition of the disciples. If he did, Judas, at the very least, would have been excluded. If the ideal state of mental health is a state of perfect contemplation and enjoyment of God, then none of us are mentally healthy. Yet all of us are worthy of washing each other's feet and having our own feet washed. In this way, a state of mental health is not a requirement for entrance into God's kingdom. Rather, perfect mental health ought to be an ideal that is situated in the already but not yet framework of Christ's kingdom. Christ has already established his kingdom in the sense that he has inaugurated a community of mutual submission and love that edifies all its members. Christ's present kingdom includes people from all over the mental health spectrum. Yet in the eschaton, we know that we will all be made well. We operate now with a trajectory toward the eschaton. This means we are called to support and encourage the mental health of all who belong to Christ insofar as is possible in the present age. Foot washing's illumination of mental health also helps frame principles regarding artificial intelligence. Any use of AI that hinders the ability and disposition of people to contemplate God, enjoy him, and love others should be discouraged. Earlier, I briefly discussed how cognitively offloading tasks regularly can result in the diminishment of certain cognitive abilities. If we offload those mental tasks that build and maintain intellectual virtues and certain intellectual skills, we risk diminishing our ability to contemplate God. For instance, if I consistently rely on AI to frame my prayers, analyze the biblical text, or simulate conversations with my neighbors in place of doing these things myself, I risk atrophying my capacity to contemplate God and love my neighbors in important ways. If my use of AI reduces my ability to contemplate God and love my neighbor, I am less mentally healthy than I would have been without using AI. Beyond these individualistic concerns, we must be careful that we do not attempt to substitute AI for authentic human community. As we've seen in foot washing, love is profoundly expressed in receiving and respecting someone else's vulnerability and in making oneself vulnerable to the loving acts of another. AI cannot be vulnerable in the same way human beings can. Vulnerability entails the risk of harm. In the foot washing liturgy, the recipient, by offering their foot to the washer, risks both physical and emotional harm. It is possible the foot washer could shame them or maim their foot. Similarly, the washer risks the possibility of physical harm while stooped low and the possibility of being received shamefully in the mind of the recipient. Perhaps the recipient thinks the washer is less valuable than the recipient, and the act is simply a way to reinforce such a hierarchy. It is hard to imagine how AI could be harmed in such a way, and thus to be vulnerable in the same way. First, it is not clear that AI can have a subjective sense of risk akin to humans. If this is the case, AI cannot modulate its fear for the sake of giving itself to a human being in the same way a human can modulate his or her fear for the sake of giving himself or herself to another human. Moreover, mutual vulnerability allows both washer and recipient to encounter one another by bypassing many of the emotional and social barriers associated with general discourse. In instituting foot washing, Jesus inverted the hierarchical expectations by removing social boundaries that prevented the disciples from encountering each other as one like himself. No longer should they contend to see who would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven and sit at Jesus' right hand. Instead, when they washed each other's feet, they would be reminded that they were handling the foot of someone for whom and to whom Jesus gave himself in the same way he gave himself to them. Even if AI is integrated into some kind of physical substrate like a robotic body, this would not be possible. If I was to wash the foot of a robot, I'm not washing the foot of someone to whom Jesus gave himself or for whom Jesus gave himself. AI neither feels love nor needs love or redemption. Rather, I'm washing the foot of a human creation designed to make human life more efficient. Because AI is not a person for or to whom Jesus gave himself, AI cannot take the place of human beings in interpersonal relationships. After all, Jesus told the disciples, "Love one another even as I have loved you." Vulnerability, however, was not the primary focus of foot washing. Instead, vulnerability is a means by which the disciples encountered Jesus and encountered each other in a more intimate way. Because they were less guarded, they were more open to receiving Jesus and coming to know him. The beginning of John's gospel states that Jesus revealed the glory of God. In washing the disciples' feet, Jesus revealed his love toward them, his desire for community with them, and his hope for their salvation. AI does not love, desire, or hope, and is thus incapable of revealing itself to human beings in these ways. Additionally, because AI does not have a rich phenomenological mental life, it cannot understand and receive human beings' revelation of themselves in these kinds of ways. Thus, Jesus' act of love and self-revelation facilitated the reception of love and self-revelation in the community. Similarly, the vulnerability shown among members of the Christian community, while foot washing facilitates receptivity toward understanding one another and receiving love from each other. It is hard to see how AI could encourage this kind of open receptivity from believers. In fact, in many cases, the more human AI seems, the more guarded people tend to be. For at least these reasons, AI, by its very nature, cannot substitute for human beings in Christian community. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip to the last paragraph. The rest of these paragraphs are just summarizing where the paper's already been. So last paragraph. So as not to be guilty of false advertising and disappointing expectant readers or listeners like you, I will end by addressing the title of this paper. In the title, I asked whether psychotic robots should wash feet. In light of my analysis, I believe the answer is a resounding no, at least regarding the foot washing liturgy. First, it is not clear whether it is possible for robots to be psychotic. We use terms like hallucinations as an analog for instances when generative AI seems to make up facts. Yet these events are not phenomenologically rich like human mental experiences. This helps us to clue us into the fact that AI lacks important capacities that humans have. Second, even if it were possible for robots to be psychotic, psychosis is not a condition which disqualifies one from washing feet. On the contrary, all people are less than perfectly mentally healthy, and one's degree of mental health does not disqualify one from Christian community. Rather, psychotic robots should not wash feet because they are not the kind of things which can give or receive love in the way that foot washing is designed to facilitate. Thank you.
I'm going to begin the discussion by addressing some very important matters. The question of foot washing versus feet washing. When I was a young man at 21 years old, I was driving to an ETS meeting with Leroy Forlines, and I asked him a very profound question. You know, in the Southeast, we said feet washing. And I said, why is it that so many Free Will Baptists say feet washing instead of foot washing? And I was prepared for a very profound answer. And he said, 'cause there's two.
Hey, if it makes you feel any better, maybe I'm being ecumenical. When I first wrote the paper, I split it. And sometimes I talked about foot, and sometimes I said feet. So
I noticed you said feet a few times. How many say feet washing? Raise your hand. How many say foot washing? Raise your hand. About half and half. And, you know, I found up in the mountains, in the Appalachia, they say foot washing a lot. Okay, now, really serious questions. Philip. Yeah.
First of all, Dr. Blehm, thank you for a great paper. That was an excellent paper. And I wanted to ask, so a question that occurred to me as you were going through your conclusion and how you showed this excellent kind of connection between this embodied practice and then how do we think about AI is, what about the converse aspect of this, which is when we start to treat a robot or an object as a person, how does that malform our spirits as we are doing that in the reverse? So have you given any thought to that particular aspect?
That's a great question. I like the way you frame that. So I guess I might go back to the reporter, right, who was, and she went into the experience with the chatbot eyes open, right? She's doing this specifically to expose it. And she noted that even she kind of got caught up in it. And one of the things is I've read about some of these chatbots is part of the reason that they're so effective is I can talk with the chatbot when I want to, and then I can ignore it when I want to. But when I come back to it, it's still there. And a lot of people comment when they're giving feedback about these chatbots, it never judges me, right? It never says, and when you read these conversations, it's always positive, it's always affirming. And so I think that there is something really, really powerful and really seditious in that. Because, there's been proposals in, of mental health, like you can have your individualized chatbot therapist or something like that, because we don't have enough people to go around. But at the same time, that's not what a relationship is, right? Well, I'm married. My wife is not always affirming to me, and rightly so. Right? If she was, I wouldn't be half the person I am today, because that is sanctifying, right? So I think that might be one way in that's malforming, is that we come to have this expectation out of relationships. And this you can read some of this. This happens. Like we come to have this expectation of other people that they should be like the robot, that they should be always affirming, non-judgmental, right? It's one being loving, as we know, thinking about like Matthew 18 and 1 Corinthians 5, sometimes being loving is trying to call someone out and helping them to live better because it's better for them and it's better for everyone. So I would say that was one way. It's a great question.
Another question. Love the paper. Very, very good. I wonder if you've interacted at all with Cal Newport?
No, I haven't.
Okay, he's Georgetown, technology and ethics. So founding faculty member there. He talks a lot about AI. He talks a lot about these chatbots. These chatbots, even ChatGPT. This is recorded. I'm not videoed right now, right? I have somebody in my church who calls chat like it's a person.
And that's all the kids are doing that too.
Yeah. And very, very effective. And it's not, she didn't go into it creating a character. It's very much so. Newport talks a lot about the detriments of AI, but I love what you've done with this paper in making a theological claim about the telos of humanity, because he gets very much into personal, everybody's got what makes them tick, and you just got to find that out. And this isn't helping you, but you've made it very theological here. And I think there's something that, a question that I have, you mentioned here on page 23 that feet washing is a reminiscent act looking back towards Jesus' crucifixion and his second coming. There's some patristic interpretations of feet washing that actually include the incarnation of Jesus. So Jesus knowing that he came from the Father and going back to the Father, and he takes off his garment and he puts on the form of a servant, and he washes feet. And then he tells Peter, if I don't do this, you have no part of me. And so I think beyond just enjoyment of God, you could even talk about union with Christ and participation within his incarnation and his taking on our flesh in this way, so that the telos of humanity is, right, conformity to the image of Jesus. I think it'd be one way, theologically, to bolster this beautiful claim that you've made here.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, so the fathers and him washing the disciples' feet is the incarnation, right? And that you're right, that beautifully dovetails in, I think, with the emphasis on embodiment, because that whole act is embodied. Yeah. And he's using, I'm going to have to think about that. That's really good. I appreciate that.
Next question.
I enjoyed lots of this paper.
Awesome, great.
One of them making me realize, obviously, human interaction, things we interact with that God had touch with, whether it's nature, human beings, scripture, creates flourishing in our lives. So reminding us that AI is not one of those things. The other thing is the helpful section where you were talking about mental health as it connects to people's perception and ability to enjoy and participate in feet washing was wonderful for me to hear. On that sense of people, the vulnerability of that there could be a really good reason other than just maybe they don't love God as much as I do, of why people aren't participating, or they might feel more comfortable with observing it from afar versus actual participating. I thought that was really good and really important, so I really appreciate all that. I thought it was a wonderful paper.
Thank you. Well, I got to tell you, by the way, when I was reading the Joseph and Asenath story, so I only read that section of it in the story, I thought of your, this years ago, your chapel series on Song of Solomon, especially when she said, your feet are my feet, my hands are your hands. I thought that was a really cool overlap there.
Yeah, so I just took the mic from Kenny. I'm sitting right here next to him. First, I'd like to say I love the question about the malformation of ourselves and how you talked about the atrophy of the mind in the paper, about how relationships require effort, and like you talked about your wife not always being, affirming of things you do. And I like how the paper went into the fact that AI and discussions with large language models take that away from us. And my question may be getting a little outside of the scope of the paper, because this is specifically about feet washing and being intimate and vulnerable between human being, the Lord's creations. But on page 27, you say, any use of AI that hinders the ability and disposition of people to contemplate God, enjoy Him, and love others should be discouraged. And something that I've thought through throughout the entire paper is you see communities in small rural areas where they have lots of these open spaces and these huge data centers that pollute regional water and stuff like that get put in, and it even in the short term we've seen a drive down of life expectancy in those areas. Is there a way that we as Christians who are called to be good stewards and love our neighbors and do what is best for each other as believers, is there a way that we can rationalize and justify a use of large language models as they currently sit with the harm that they do to our fellow man?
Yeah, good. So I know there's a whole subsection of philosophers that are working on this problem and it within the context of injustice. So maybe not quite in the theological context. And I confess that I'm ignorant of a lot of that work. But I think you raised some really good points that we don't often think about. The environmental impact, both the social environment and the natural environment. And understanding what those impacts are, we should be careful to mitigate those as much as possible and to think of what is AI doing for us and what's the trade-off. If there has to be a trade-off, is it worth it? And I think that's the place to start, because the reason that a lot of times this is a general issue with bioethics in general, right? We figure out how to do something, and then 20 years later, we figure out whether we should or not. And I think that's where we're at, though I think the pace is catching up. And so the first place to start would be, should we, right? Is the benefit of this AI worth the possible destruction here? Or is there a way that we can mitigate that by, renewable energy is another fraught kind of way, but to think about it maybe in that way. Good.
Well, let's thank Dr. Blehm for this excellent paper.
Thank you.
We'll have some fellowship, and we appreciate your being here tonight. We encourage you to come back tomorrow morning. We'll be gathering at 8:30 a.m. Good night.